I've still got this as well.
Okay, okay.
I'm sorry for the people at home that you didn't hear us. Do you want me to read?
Yeah, maybe do it again.
Yes. Okay, sorry people at home, we forgot to unmute ourselves. I will briefly reread the bio of Tyson Retz so that everyone knows who our first speaker will be. So our first speaker is Tyson Retz. He's Associate Professor of History at the University of Stavanger in Norway. He received his PhD in history from the University of Melbourne, where he was also a postdoctoral fellow. He is the author of Empathy and History, a dual exploration of empathy's intellectual and educational history, and also of the soon-to-appear Cambridge element entitled Progress and the Scale of History, which is also the title and the subject of his talk for today. So I will give now the word to Tyson, and I hope, that everyone can hear us at home, but it seems to be all right. So go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks everyone for coming here so soon after lunch too. All right, now what I am talking about today is soon going to, I'm working on it presently, and I suppose this is the last opportunity I'll have to incorporate feedback. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion at the end. Belief in progress, I think, long fell into disrepute. After reaching its high point in the 19th century, the 20th century quickly demonstrated humankind's ability to put its achievements to devastating ends. The word increasingly appeared in sardonic scare quotes. Studies on the history of the idea abounded, and progress as critics were held up as frequently as earlier generations had celebrated its profits. A quarter way into the 21st century, there doesn't seem to be much sign that progress is set to regain its former renown. Optimists prosper in certain circles, but pessimism is very much in vogue. There now seems a widespread attitude that our current day may not, after all, be the newest phase in the movement towards a better future. Oh, now I can't change.
Enter.
No.
I don't know how this goes.
I could do it just before, so I did test it.
Okay, let me check if we can. I'm sorry. We can. How do we? This computer is not working as well. I'm sorry, we have a little problem with the PowerPoint. There we go. No.
Sometimes I find if you share it just through the present screen, this doesn't happen.
Yes, maybe now. Let's try again.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. I'm sorry for the delay also to you.
No problem. So as I mentioned, this work is soon to appear in a Cambridge element. Daniel Wolfe being the editor-in-chief of that series. Exciting times for history, theory and practice, it seems, with that coming out soon. And my challenge is to offer an introduction, an accessible introduction to the idea of progress, global in scope, in under 30,000 words. And I ask, how does the scale on which we conceive history shape how we think about progress? But to get back to my opening comments there, in spite of the skepticism about progress, it has remained difficult to escape its logic and its large constellation of family resemblances. In its entourage are notions of development, evolution, change, order, process, advance, not to mention thorny questions of chronology, linearity, teleology, and periodization. Critical as I am of the idea of progress, I must still describe my element as in some way concerned with how progress has evolved as an idea, with plotting its development through time. And I have, of course, thought carefully about the order in which the ideas follow from one another. I also trust that readers will make good progress through the text, which is not merely to expect that they will read from one page to the next, but that their understanding of the idea of progress will improve with every passing page. If there's one thing that progress is supposed to offer us, it's an improvement on what came before. And perhaps it's this promise for improvement that explains the enormous political authority that progress continues to command. Under the slogan, "Dare More Progress," German Chancellor and Social Democrat Olaf Scholz entered office just last year, vowing to lead a progress coalition for a German people, in his words, united by our belief in progress. The political appeal of progress stems largely from its progressive agenda, items that, at least on the left, may include today renewable energy targets, affordable housing, legalising cannabis, relaxing citizenship laws, and lowering the voting age. It's a curious feature, I think, of contemporary political culture that one can support such goals, describe oneself as politically progressive, and at the same time scoff at the idea of progress, as if it were possible to like spicy food but not spice, technological gadgets but not technology. Now, if it's been said that all Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato, in the history of ideas, all discussion of progress has had to contend with J.B. Berry's century-old and hugely influential account. According to Berry, belief in progress emerged as a modern and secular substitute for the earlier religious belief in providence. Only with the weakening of religious belief could progress come of age as a new secular faith. Berry wrote that this new faith involved a synthesis of the past and a prophecy of the future. To believe in progress was to have historical knowledge indicating that society has moved in a desirable direction, to perceive the continuation of this movement in the present, and to expect more of it in the future. Further, and this is an important point, this movement had to be the result of human activity, not an external will, godly or otherwise. The idea of progress thus brings into view questions of human agency that have been central to the history discipline. Berry, the admirer of Condorcet and Comte, gives us a definition that is not so outworn as it might seem. In fact, his three conditions for belief in progress translate easily into the language of present-day historical theory. How the past, present, and future fit together today is one of the principal concerns of historical theory. And when it comes to these relations, many believe in the style of Heidegger, Koselleck, and Hartog that the fundamental characteristic is the predominance of the category of the future. Historians are sensing time more than ever, and the perception of movement that to Berry defined the idea of progress might now be described as perceiving oneself somewhere between the field of experience and the horizon of expectation. In addition to the focus on futures past, the so-called temporal turn has also expanded the scale on which historians study the past. Big history and deep history are reactions against the perceived temporal shallowness of traditional historiography, and new approaches to world history and global history signify attempts to surpass traditional spatial demarcations. The expansion of time is also the expansion of space, but scale can mean more. The deep history advocate and champion of Australian Aboriginal history, Anne McGrath, invokes the exteriors of fish and dinosaurs, dental plaque, music, and dry human skin. Scale can denote climbing up or over and separating things into layers. Most of all, however, scale denotes a relation to distance, and in the new expanded view of the past, some have asked whether we can still make out the purposefully acting agent of humanistically orientated historiography. At stake, it seems, are the philological principles of a discipline founded in source criticism. This tension is central to my account. The question behind my work sprang from the concern that the new expanded scale of history is one through which it might be difficult to observe the human agents who, by Giambattista Vico's famous and discipline-making formulation, made history with their own hands. Here I am committed to the principle that progress, if it's to have a meaning distinguishable from neighbouring concepts, is the result of purposeful human action. Progress is change that human beings value and bring about as a consequence of the objectives they have in mind. What counts as progress is what human beings have determined to be desirable, and in that respect, progress has been at the centre of history conceived as inquiry into the changing and context-dependent nature of human hopes, beliefs, and desires. In the current climate of historical theory and practice, the question worth exploring is how history conceived on different scales both illuminates and obscures purposeful human agents living in the tension of freedom and necessity. My little element examines the idea of progress within different conceptions of history, as well as how they reflect human action alongside the deep structures of society and environment. Of course, the fact that progress involves an ascription of value raises questions over who decides what is valuable and on what terms. And attention to scale helps with this dimension too. It enables us to examine both the timescales from which we draw our historical knowledge and the standards of valuation according to which we weigh and apportion value to different aspects of the past. It allows us to track back and forth between conceptions of progress and the philosophies of history in which they are enmeshed. I've developed 5 categories that disaggregate the conceptual features of this modernity's master concept. Here is but the briefest of possible summaries of each one. No progress is about a time when time itself was seen to destroy things rather than improve things. I distinguish belief in progress from belief in developmental improvement, meaning available vertically from meaning to be gained horizontally, and point to the overall preference in ancient societies for spatial rather than temporal metaphors, prioritizing stability, harmony, and integration over future striving towards something better. If I had written the abstract for this talk more recently, I probably would have spent the entire time talking about what distinguishes progress from developmental improvement. Progress is a fundamentally future-orientated doctrine, as much about the achievements we expect in the future as the evidence we have of past achievements. My second category, absolute progress, is the forward movement of humanity viewed on the scale of universal history, the lens through which clear patterns could be discerned, grand systems laid out, and progress declared a law of nature. Construing history as a series of stages, Europeans could travel to distant lands and experience themselves as witnesses to early stages of history, setting in train pernicious justifications for the subjugation of peoples seen to be located at inferior stages. Progress came of age when the future shifted from being viewed as predetermined and beyond the reach of human intervention to something capable of being actively construed by purposeful human action in the present. Absolutist pretensions aside, relative progress faces up to the problem of there being no agreed standard for evaluating progress. In the Darwinian world of conflict and competition, progress for some meant decline for others. Among the examples casting light on the incommensurability of progress, I bring particular attention to the leadership role that Japan played in the eyes of marginalized groups worldwide: African Americans, Australian Aboriginals, Indians under the yoke of British rule. I also set alongside each other the concepts of progress and tradition in the example of the iconoclastic Chinese May 4th movement, as well as an obscure Hindu spiritualist. Having outlined the conceptual fundamentals, the last 2 sections explore a network of tributaries with short episodes from the mid-20th century onwards. Everybody's progress was an absolute presupposition of 20th century political life, pursued by planning or by leaving progress to occur in the spontaneous order of the neoliberal marketplace. For the historian politician Jawaharlal Nehru, for example, history was a point of reference that shifted in meaning as he went about instilling a sense of historical purpose and directionality, the great planner, Nehru. As for the market alternative, I highlight the conception, or rather non-conception, of history at the heart of neoliberalism. To achieve progress required the destruction of all constructions of historical directionality. By the final quarter of the 20th century, the craving for economic growth had reached such proportions as to make statistics the prime means for charting the nation's progressive movement from past to present and setting benchmarks for future effort. Finally, anti-progress embodies the ethos of a modern-day society. We talked about this modern-day society a lot yesterday, seemingly weary of the idea of progress, one that invokes the idea of crisis more than progress, perhaps. Within the discipline of history, an influential accusation is that history suffers from a crisis of short-termism, and a proposed remedy is that history re-engage with present-day society by harnessing the possibilities of enlarged temporal outlooks. In question is the fundamental idea that history is the story of what human beings have made with their own hands. Human beings have become viewed as geological agents and makers of all-pervasive technologies that their actions now serve. On the other hand, history's attentive to the fine grain of historical context continue to foreground human action as the site where history is made. Some of the most convincing studies subverting the idea of progress have come from historicists working on the small scale of institutional, economic, and political context, those who reveal progress as history, as something belonging to a past constellation of conditions that we should not expect to be repeated. And now I'll conclude. I tried to show in my presentation that progress is a philosophy of history that presupposes specific relations between the past, the present, and the future. it emerged as a specific orientation, temporal orientation, governing ideas about human purpose in intellectual conditions specific to time and place, which from then on have been accepted, rejected, modified, and reconceived. Now, what about the present-day pessimism, skepticism, and preoccupation with crisis that I began with? A solution to the heavy baggage that progress brings with it might be to dispense with the noun and to redouble our efforts to clarify the nature of progressing. Now, there is substantial precedent to do so. While nouns or names are often elusive, the verbs or actions tend not to be. For example, when memory has proved too thorny to define, more common ground among scholars has been found by examining the action of remembering. When we cannot pin down exactly what defines a period or periodization, shifting attention to the action of periodizing brings into view the range of phenomena being thought through in the process. Now, if we are to go ahead with this proposal, my sense is that we would end up with the concept of developmental improvement, keenly aware of the advances made in the past, but unfortunately silent on the matter of the future direction of humanity. I'm a Vickian at heart, and I find it hard to move from the position that the practice of history would be poorly served by abandoning the principle that our capacity for fellow feeling and understanding offers us inside knowledge of what human beings have created with their own hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm now looking into the room if there's clarification questions. If not, then we proceed to our second speaker. One moment, please. We will have to change PowerPoint. Do you know where the... No, where is it? Do you know where it is? I'm not used to working with them. This one. Yeah. Yes, okay. I'm sorry for the delay. All right, so our second speaker is, and I'm trying to pronounce it correctly, Taynna Mendonça Marino. Taynna. And she is a PhD student in history at the Doctoral School of Humanity at Mickiewicz University in Poznan. Mickiewicz. I hope people know what I'm referring to. In Poznan in Poland, under the supervision of Professor Ewa Domanska. And today she will be giving a presentation for us on transcultural empathy, rethinking Western historical knowledge through indigenous cosmologies. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So this is the title of my presentation. I have here a summary, and I will read my abstract for you, and then I will continue my presentation. The concept of empathy has been widely explored in a broad range of literature across disciplines such as philosophy of mind, phenomenology, psychology, psychoanalysis, sociology, anthropology, biology, and zoology. This means that the concept has different definitions and applications, My aim in this presentation is not to historicize the concept through its roots in hermeneutics, aesthetics, and moral philosophy, nor to discuss the overlaps and difference between the various definitions of empathy. Instead, I seek to point out some of the limits of empathy as a way of knowing and engaging with historical subjects in the past and present, and indicate some contributions of indigenous cosmologies, epistemologies, and worldviews to a future-oriented historical knowledge. Thus, discussing possibilities of empathy through historical knowledge does not mean defending empathy from the harsh critics it has undergone, but how these critics can inform alternative ways to rethink the role of empathy in historical thinking, to embrace other ways of relating, inhabiting, experience, and knowing the world. So I will first talk about the limits of empathy within Western historical knowledge, and then I will talk about the contributions of Davi Kopenawa and Ailton Krenak to think about the relations between indigenous and Western historical knowledge. And I have many questions, but some of them are, is there still a place for empathy in historical thinking? Is there a kind of empathy capable of building bridges between indigenous and Western historical thinking? Empathy is a concept that has already been subjected to several criticisms as epistemic capacity to know the other, and among them, its common sense definition as putting oneself in the other's shoes or seeing the world through the other's eyes implies a vicarious introspection in which it is necessary to be aware of the self-other distinction in order to avoid the projection or incorporation of the other. Another critique is based on an over-reliance on the role of imagination to transcend experience. In the colonial theories and strands of Black thought, especially in Afro-pessimism, there is a great disbelief in the role of empathy to account for the experience of racism, for instance, in which it's not possible to put a privileged white person in the place of an underprivileged Black person. Even though empathy also involves imagination, it needs to be aware of the periods of empathy as an intellectual, imaginative capacity that does not sufficiently problematize the neutrality and rationality of the knower, by considering the material and embodied conditions of historical subjects in our inclination to empathize or not with the other. In short, empathy as a way of understanding is controversial because, on the one hand, it seeks to avoid the pitfalls of non-differentiated identification of the other. On the other hand, it deepens notion of identity, founded on the binaries self-other, subject-object, West, no-West, human-on-human, reason, emotions, and so on. Another problem frequently mentioned in critics of empathy has to do with the role of empathy in engaging and responding to the other's needs, emotions, and experiences. Besides the notion of empathy as a way to understand the other, the concept came to encompass a range of meanings that brings it closer to pro-social concepts and emotions, such as sympathy, compassion, love, solidarity, altruism, recognition, identification, care, and is connected to the ethics of becoming, thinking, and relating with others. The criticism is that identifying with certain subjects at expense of others can lead to silencing and reproducing epistemic violence. Given that empathizing can imply an identification with the oppressor or appropriation of the experience of the oppressed. Still, empathizing with the oppressed further increases the epistemic privilege of the oppressor as a knower and deepens even more the distance between the empathizer and the empathized. Even though my intention is not to define empathy, but to understand it in a broad sense as a way of relating, I believe that Carsten Stilber's definition of empathy-related phenomenon implies to the proposal of this communication. According to Stilber, empathy involves a wide range of psychological capacities that are thought of as being central for constituting humans as social creatures, allowing us to know what other people are thinking and feeling, to emotionally engage with them, to share their thoughts and feelings, and to care for their well-being. So, when I'm talking about indigenous thinking right now, indigenous peoples for hundreds of years have been seen as those who are understood, or at least we attempt to understood, and seen as mere objects of historical Eurocentric vision. However, in recent decades, there has been a growing body of work in academia on indigenous peoples and their worldviews that sets out to respond to this view of indigenous peoples as subalterns who are voiceless or who lack complex theoretical thinking about the world. This also goes along, of course, with the gain in representativeness of these peoples in the political sphere. Indigenous people are increasingly gaining spaces to speak out on global issues, such as climate warming and the responsible use of nature resources to serve global capitalism. In Brazil, two indigenous leaders are prominent in the defense of indigenous people's rights. Their ways of being in the world, In Brazil, two indigenous leaders are prominent in the defense of indigenous people's rights, their ways of being in the world, and a call for dialogue between indigenous and non-indigenous people to discuss problems of global order. In the books, The Falling Sky by Davi Kopenawa and Ideas to Postpone the End of the World by Ailton Krenak, both translated into English, the authors show themselves as spokespersons of indigenous thoughts for non-indigenous people. In their books, Kopenawa and Krenak outline some ideas that can inform Western historical thinking around the problem of empathy, even if this word is not directly used by these authors. So here I have like this. I have a photo of Davi Kopenawa Yanomami, who is a Yanomami shaman and a spokesperson for the conservation of Amazon rainforest. He's the author of The Following Sky, Words of Yanomami Shaman, and also a co-author in the documentary The Last Forest, released last year. And now I brought some quotations of these authors so that I can talk about a little bit about transcultural empathy. So this first quotation, I will read it. Today, white people think we should imitate them in every way. Yet, this is not what we want. I learned their ways from childhood, and I speak a little of their language. Yet, I do not want to be one of them. I think that we will only be able to become white people the day white people transform themselves into Yanomami. White people say they are intelligent, but we are not any less intelligent. Our thoughts unfurl in every direction, and our words are ancient and numerous. They are the words of our ancestors. Yet, unlike white people, we do not need image skins to prevent them from escape. Image skins here is printed documents, like written documents. Image skins because it's the skin of the tree. So it's a tree skin. And we do not need to draw them, like the white people do with theirs. They will not disappear, for they remain fixed inside us. So Kopenawa is very interesting because he's talking to non-indigenous people, and he has this kind of conflictive sometimes position, but also he's very open to dialogue, to build something together. Another quotation of him. Since the beginning of time, Omama, who is the demiurge, has been the center of what the white people call ecology. It's true. Long before these words exist among them and they started to speak about them so much, they were already in us, though we do not name them in the same way. For the shamans, these have always been words that came from the spirits to defend the forest. If you had books like they do, the white people could see how old these words are. In the forest, we human beings are the ecology, but it's equally the shapiri, the game, the trees, the rivers, the fish, the sky, the rain, the wind, and the sun. It's everything that came into being in the forest, far from the white people. Everything that isn't surrounded by fences yet. So ecology for him is not only human beings, but all part of the nature. And Schopenhauer doesn't like the word environment. So he's talking about ecology. There is other quotation. There is only one sky, and we must take care of it. The book is entitled "The Falling Sky." So he's talking about this idea of one sky. We must take care of it, for if it becomes sick, everything will come to an end. This may not take place right now, but it could happen later. Then it will be our children, their children, or the children of the children who will die. This is why I tell the white people these words of warning that I have heard from every great shaman. Through them, I want to make them understand that they should dream further and pay attention to the voices of the forest spirits. So here, I like very much in this quotation the idea of pay attention to the voices, the idea of attentiveness, and I think this is very important to the idea of empathy that I'm trying to develop. This other thinker, Ailton Krenak, is an indigenous thinker and movement leader of Krenak ethnic group, and he's the author of Postpone the End of the World, which is translated to English, and also other two books that are in Portuguese, but Tomorrow is Not for Sale and Life is Hardly Useful. I'd like to show some quotations of Ailton Krenak as well. How much? We still have now 7 minutes. Okay. So the notion that white Europeans could jump in their ships and go colonizing the rest of the world was based on the premise that there was an enlightened humanity that had to go in search of the benighted humanity and bring those savages into their incredible light. This call to civilization was always justified by the idea there is a right way of being in the world, one truth or concept of truth that has guided the choices made down through history. Now, at the start of the 21st century, collaborations between thinkers with distinct visions derived from different cultures are enabling us to critique the idea. Are we really a humanity? How can we justify calling ourselves a humanity when 70% of us are totally alienated from even the minimal exercise of being? When the majority of us are denied any real agents because the world we are living in does not want or require our input, only our custom. So how I like very much this quotation because I think it brings the idea that indigenous people and their worldviews, their cosmologies are not only objects of historical knowledge or anthropology and so on. They can be also subject of theoretical thinking and practical thinking, of course, but also theoretical. The other quotation, how can we find a point of contact between these two worlds, the Western and non-Western? which share the same orange but have drifted so far apart that today we have at one extreme those who need a river in order to live, at the other those who consume rivers as mere resources. Regarding this notion of resource attributed to a mountain, a river, a forest, where can we possibly find this intersection between our opposing visions that might save us from the state of blindness toward one another? So he has a similar perspective than David Schopenhauer, because he's trying to build this dialogue between Western and non-Western. The last quotation, sorry, is about the title of his book, The End of the World, Ideas to Postpone the End of the World, and how he see what is to postpone the end of the world. The end of the world is never so close as when you have worlds on either side of a divide, each trying to guess what the other is doing. There is abyss, there is a fall. So the question we need to ask is, why are we so afraid of falling when fall is all we ever done? We fall into different degrees in different places across the planet, but we are still terrified of what will happen when the next topple comes. Why do we hate the sensation of falling? It happens, that's all we've been doing of late, falling. So why are we so upset over it now? We feel insecure, even paranoid even, because all the other outcomes we can see require the implosion of the house we inherit, believe in fear of losing. Let's put our creative and critical capacity to use to make some colorful parachutes to slow the fall, turning into something exciting and edifying. So I think this quotation is very, very important, because he's talking about the anxiety of Western knowledge, of this idea of implosion, the house we inherited. So I think it's very important to think that maybe we need to lose this house and think something from that, beyond that. So I like very much this quotation. Let's put our creative and critical capacity to make some colorful parachutes to slow the fall, turn into something exciting and edifying. So I think it's related to what I'm trying to bring as a transcultural empathy. So I will just conclude my argument with this notion of transcultural empathy that I'm still developing, so it's a work in progress. And as I see, transcultural empathy is a way to address the recognition and appreciation of the multiplicity of ways of knowing and relating. Empathy, as intended to educate, is a bridging concept for a future-oriented ethics of coexistence, collaboration, and reciprocity, to quote Mestdagh, that stands against the binary opposition between Western and non-Western knowledge, historical and non-historical ways of knowing. Transcultural empathy is not just an empathy between cultures, it's not just intercultural empathy, it's not directed from one culture to another. Rather, transcultural empathy is about multidirectional interaction between cultures that make it possible to build plural epistemologies. They are not just historical, but that is able to include different historical and non-historical approaches, epistemologies and cosmologies, theories and practices. However, I'm still speculating about this idea of transcultural empathy, and it's still a work in progress, as I said. Nevertheless, thinking Western historical knowledge through indigenous cosmologies is to reflect upon what kind of bridges is possible and desirable to build between indigenous and non-indigenous Western and non-Western worlds and worlds. So I address the question, what we need to learn from indigenous cosmologies to move beyond anthropocentrism and Eurocentrism, as well as to dismantle the binary oppositions that underpin Western historical thinking. Of course, it's a question without answer by now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. First, any clarification questions? If not, then let's go to our third. Moira Perez has a short question.
Okay, I will make it short.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I was just thinking of the challenges of doing history interculturally or transculturally. I remember what Trouillot said about how can we make history about the unimaginable. And I am starting to think that maybe Western and white knowledge has the agency of marginalized subjects as something that is just unimaginable. Like, it's not only unimaginable to think of the river as a living being, it's also unimaginable to think of someone from the South as an epistemic agent in the social ontology of the academic North. I don't know if you have thought about this in the sense that empathy would need to include in the first place the possibility of understanding those subjects as epistemic subjects, which I'm not sure is actually possible in the North. Thank you.
I'm guessing, Moira, that the answer to this question is a little bit more elaborated than simply clarifying. So let's maybe keep that for discussion afterwards, because we still have a third presentation to go to, but we can come back to the points that you raised during the discussion time. So our third presentation is by João, again, I'm sorry if I'm not João de Azevedo et Dias Duarte.
That's great.
You can already share your screen if you have a presentation, PowerPoint presentation. He obtained his PhD from the Pontifícia Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro in 2013. And he's an intellectual historian of early modern Europe, focusing in particular on 17th and 18th century Britain. He's mainly interested in the following themes: history and historicity of the Enlightenment, history and literature, theory and history of the novel, religion, history and politics in early modern Europe. And the title of his presentation for today is Enlightenment and Religion, Rupture or Continuity. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eline. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Oh, hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Eline, for introducing me, and thank you, dear colleagues, for your beautiful and very interesting presentations. And of course, for hearing me out also. I'm actually envious of you there in Puebla. I have made arrangements to travel back in 2020, but this time I wasn't able to. Anyway, I'm happy to have the opportunity to participate, even if it's remotely. I'll be talking to you today about Enlightenment and religion, which was my original proposal back in 2019. Although we have been given the opportunity to submit a different paper, I decided to stick with my original choice, which is by now a published article. And the reason is that it raises a general question that still interests me and that I believe deserves further discussion. The question that is of the heritage of what is called the Enlightenment, or to put it in another, more direct way, what's left of Enlightenment? A question we've been asking ourselves for quite some time now. I'd like to focus today on that question, what's left of Enlightenment, that old question. And I'll begin with a quick diagnostic or overview of the field. in spite of 40 or 50 years of heavy criticism from several strands of critical thinking, from postmodern to decolonial theory, in spite of its fracturing by the scholarship into several small pieces, a wide variety of regional and thematic enlightenments, the Enlightenment did not disappear, nor became something of a mere antiquarian interest. In fact, it seems livelier than ever. There has been, in recent years, an upsurge in academic publications on the Enlightenment, from very specialized monographs to larger syntheses catering to a wider public. Bestsellers such as Enlightenment Now by the cognitive psychologist and pop writer Steven Pinker also testify to the vitality of the Enlightenment. In that case, in a very classical clothing, as an unabashedly defense of progress, reason, and science. Enlightenment is also mentioned in the mainstream media in connection with hot topics of the day, from the climate crisis to the spread of misinformation, from the science and politics of vaccination to the war and the state of democracy in the world. It seems then that, like it or not, the Enlightenment is not going away anytime soon and will continue to play an important role in historical and other disciplinary research, as well as in broader debates about issues such as the future of democracy, the social and environmental effects of science and technology, or the role of religion in contemporary life. While there is no getting rid of the Enlightenment, perhaps the current historical and historiographical moment provides an opportunity to establish a different understanding of it. If that is so, how can historical research contribute to an effective understanding of the Enlightenment as a useful past, without falling prey to what Michel Foucault called in 1984 the blackmail of the Enlightenment? That is, the simplistic and authoritarian alternative of being for or against it. The temptation to which many historians still fall prey is to recur to the liberal grand narrative of modernization, originally forged in the 20th century. With its asperities and contradictions downplayed or ignored, Enlightenment is reduced to a few simple ideas: rationalism, secularism, optimism, the faith in progress of science, humanism, cosmopolitanism, etc., and then brandish it like a totem or a target. Alternatively, to reducing it to a simple intellectual formula which must be defended or denounced, one might try to offer a more complex picture of it, one that seeks to do justice to its contradictions and internal polyphony, while at the same time to renew its critical capacity to interrogate the present. In my paper, I traced how the historiographic understanding of the relationship between the Enlightenment and religion has changed as a result of 4 decades of scholarship. Once thought of as an irreconcilable opposition, as in Peter Gave's 1960s towering classic, in which Enlightenment was defined as a modern form of paganism, the relationship between the Enlightenment and religion has gradually morphed into something much more entangled and complicated. Several studies have explored the different paths Enlightenment has taken in different regions of Europe, both Catholic and Protestant, emphasizing its ties to churches, seminaries, and denominational universities, as well as the role of clerics and religious movements in fostering Enlightenment ideas, values, and programs of reform. For quite some time, scholars have been talking about religious enlightenments, a Protestant enlightenment, a Catholic enlightenment, a Christian enlightenment, or even about God in the Enlightenment, or even enlightenment monks and the Enlightenment Bible. For something that used to be defined by its opposition to religion, all that religious talk should amount to a major crisis of identity. Indeed, Enlightenment was invented as a historical philosophical concept in the 19th and 20th century as the ideological matrix of modernity, or the yet unfinished project of modernity, to quote one of its heralds. In that conception, Enlightenment was supposed to be rational, was supposed to be egalitarian, democratic, and thoroughly secular. Every item of this description has been disputed by scholars by now. At the same time, modernity itself has lost much of its former luster. It has been accused of carrying a teleological conception of history, of promoting a Western-centric vision of history, of being naively progressivist or cynically polysemous, of being, in some, a heritage of another time, and historians and other social scientists felt authorized to oppose the modern, that is, themselves, to everyone else, ancient, medieval, or non-Western, all those stuck in their traditions and beliefs. Nonetheless, just like with the Enlightenment, to dispense altogether with the notion of modernity has proven difficult. One could try, though, to dissociate modernity from a progressivist grand narrative, to think of it not as an all-encompassing single epoch, nor as a specific liberal ideology that should be promoted or, on the contrary, fought off. Modernity might mean two things: a set of deep transformations that affected European and other societies following different rhythms and modalities, whose epicenter might be situated somewhere between the 750s and the beginning of the 20th century, such as urbanization, industrialization, the social division of labor, the emergence and globalization of capitalism, the rise of new techniques of communication, and etc. But modernity is also a relation to time, a new and more reflexive relation to the present, seen as different both from the past and from the future. While Reinhard Koselleck spoke of modernity as the birth of historical time, Michel Foucault conceived it as an ethos, a philosophical attitude that entailed a permanent critique of the present and of ourselves as historically constituted beings. In a similar vein, we can perhaps understand Enlightenment not as a particular philosophical or political ideology, be that rationalism, scientism, humanism, republicanism, cosmopolitanism, liberalism, or whatever ism, but as a multiple and heterogeneous movement, a plural field of discussion that opens up in reaction to the transformations of modernity. Instead of a straightforward justification of modernity, Enlightenment might be seen as an effort to problematize it. As the French historian Antoine Liti has recently defined it, the Enlightenment is neither a coherent doctrine nor a fallacious myth, but a reflexive and narrative gesture by which, from the 18th century, many authors sought to define the novelty of their time. It designates the conflicting space in which intellectuals have both thought about the experience of modernity and struggled to deepen and orient it. Religion was at the center of many of those critical and contradictory debates that constitutes the Enlightenment. In fact, Enlightenment's thinking on religion might be seen as shaped by three different but related historical processes. There is, first of all, the heritage of the Reformation. The Reformation gave rise to unprecedented religious diversity and conflict. Confessional disputes were fought not only with the sword, but also with the scholarly and erudite instruments of the late Renaissance in the field of biblical hermeneutics and ecclesiastical history, fostering in that process a sophisticated historical theological discourse of religious error, corruption, and imposture. The dissemination of this discourse and the incessant scrutiny of the biblical text and the history of the church generated not only forms of unbelief and impiety, and the notion that the Christian church and revelation were nothing more than a millenarian fraud, what is usually referred to as the radical enlightenment, but also, and more importantly, I think, it produced a new historicized way of understanding Christian identity itself. Then there was the impact of globalization. The commercial and colonial expansion flooded Europe with information about rituals and beliefs gathered around the world and disseminated through travel accounts since the 16th century. Despite having been forged in the crucible of intra-Christian sectarian disputes and biblical hermeneutics, post-Reformation religious discourse was also used to interpret this new knowledge, turning itself in the process into a universal analytic religious language, one that encompassed everything religious from antiquity to the New World. was the birth of the science of comparative history of religions, initially pursued with the pious goal of identifying a common realm of theological and practical consensus among the various world religions. Finally, there is the political problem also brought about by the Reformation of stability, peace, and civil prosperity in the context of religious pluralism. After a long period of devastating religious civil wars, many European elites became convinced that religious and public life had to be ordered in a manner that prevented religious zeal from destroying civil peace. While many arrangements for political and social stability emerged since the late 17th century, several of which authoritarian and intolerant, proposals for the separation of civil from spiritual authority and the settlement of broad schemes for religious tolerance gradually became more and more accepted. These conversations were central to the Enlightenment, which makes the idea of a simple opposition between Enlightenment and religion hard to sustain. Similarly, conventional accounts of secularization as the inevitable slide of the pre-modern religious past into the modern secular future also become untenable. Nonetheless, while it is true that religion is central to the Enlightenment and did not disappear in the modern world, it is also true that religion, as a concept, was not only transformed and shaped, but actually invented by the Enlightenment. Enlightenment conceived the idea of religion as a collective singular, that is, religion as a universal human phenomenon, a set of beliefs and practices that varies culturally. It also conceived the idea that shapes many modern institutions of religion as a relatively autonomous sphere of life, separate from other non-religious or secular spheres, such as politics, economics, or science. To return then to our initial question, what's left of Enlightenment, we could now perhaps answer that Enlightenment left us religion. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our three speakers for very wonderful presentations that I'm sure will incite lots of questions. So yeah, I'm opening the floor. I don't know if anyone wants to start by asking a question.
What I started.
Oh yeah, indeed. I was almost forgetting the very poignant remarks by Moira. Yeah, you can, if you want, reply if there's no other questions at the moment.
Okay, I can try. Thank you, Moira, for your question. Well, the agency is really a problem. So I don't know if I have a clear answer to it now, but I understand that indigenous people, they also have this kind of complex theoretical thinking, not only practical. And I understand that empathy is not only an intellectual, cognitive capacity, but also affective, embodied, material, and so on. And also a kind of prosocial behavior. So I understand in this broad sense of empathy, and I see empathy, I'm critical of this notion of only cognitive capacity, so I understand that indigenous people can also be part of this discussion on, not actually discussions on empathy, but how can we build knowledge through empathy. So I think that it's problematic to say that, for example, when you're talking about epistemic violence, epistemic injustice, how indigenous people usually play a role as a kind of subaltern, something that is not actually included. So this knowledge, even though when we are speaking about epistemic violence, we are often reproducing this kind of asymmetrical relation. So indigenous are deprived of agents in this relation, even though with the intention, with the purpose of transcending epistemic violence. So for me, it's a very difficult question. but I think that maybe we should try to think, how can we transgress or not overcome, but go beyond, go beyond this idea of Western historical knowledge, not to include other different ways of knowing in this same universal. It's not about subsuming the subject in the universal, but trying to build a plural epistemology or plural epistemologies that can integrate different kinds of knowledge, not only historical knowledge, but also what is conceived often as ahistorical or non-historical. Yeah, I don't know if I answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Taynna.
All right, other questions in the room? Maybe then I'll formulate the question if there's no one else. Okay, Alan, go ahead, Alan.
A couple of observations. I think that, of course, my notion of empathy, I have a basic notion of empathy, which is sympathy, fellow feeling, trying to get into the other. I mean, I've had that notion in my head for a long time. And what you reported about that notion, objections to it, was very familiar to me. But I recently had the experience of reading, well, not so recently, in the last study, Tyson Retz's book. And in my view, in much of theory of history and in much of the actual practice of history, empathy has a slightly different meaning. It's more the seeing of context. And I call this actually Retzian empathy. Retzian empathy. Because I was, first of all, rather angry at him for complicating what I thought about empathy. But then I realized that actually empathy for many historians it means something more than just trying to get inside the mind of the other, which I think is impossible. It means trying to understand the context within which the other operated. And you don't deal with that. I mean, you're giving us people and you're giving us a reportage of what they said. But I think a historian would be more inclined, and of course, this is articles, papers, conferences, they're very narrow things, and they're very important starting points. As a historian, who's distinguished from someone who's in years of history, I would want to hear much more about the context within which your advocate operated. That's one point I have. The other point I have is a slightly different point, and it's I think it should be taken as a bit of an objection to your terminology, not the central terminology of empathy, but another thing that you brought in, I think, mainly toward the end, the notion of plural epistemologies. And here I have a problem. I simply report the problem, and I think you could probably eliminate the problem by terminological rethinking. I want to quote you something from Alexander Dugin, and I don't know if you know Alexander Dugin at all. He is one of the philosophers of Platonism. And along with Eline, and there's a novelist whose name escapes my mind at the moment, and the Surkov. And here is something, this is Alexander Dugin on a YouTube video. I don't know whether it is in writing, but he said words to this effect: we have our knowledge, and you have yours. So we have our truth, and you have yours. And believe me, I haven't heard this, I've actually heard this in person. I used to go to Russia. One of my sponsors there said exactly the same thing to me way back, I don't know, 2013 maybe. And here's the problem. I think if you use epistemology in the way you're using it, there's something being lost. I'm a great literalist, although I'm not necessarily committed to literal meaning. What is epistemology? Well, episteme is science, and logos is a doctrine. So epistemology is the doctrine of science. And what does that mean? I was going to call my Chicago book a few years ago Historical Epistemology. It actually came out with the title Historical Knowledge, Historical Error, because the marketing manager at the University of Chicago Press exercised his power and declared that could not be the title of the book because no one would buy. What is his epistemology, it seems to me, is on the one hand, we can treat epistemology as simply a fact, a construction by certain philosophers, beginning with Aristotle, perhaps. But I confess that I'm limited to the so-called Western tradition. And I think it's a matter of, and it still is, when I thought epistemology as the title of my book, I thought of epistemology as being the set of methods that. Okay, I'm
sorry to interrupt.
Okay,
there's no, you can continue. But there's someone who said he's not quite hearing you, but the microphone can go ahead.
Okay.
So maybe if you could just speak up.
Yeah. I will speak up a bit more. I can certainly do that. Yeah, let's shift.
Yeah, that would be great.
So, on the one hand, epistemology is a kind of fact, but going to Virum factum convictum. Okay, so already a very sophisticated notion of fact back in 1730. Epistemology is a set of, it tries to articulate methods, theories, and so on that will maximize the chance of arriving at truth and minimize, notice I didn't say the truth, and minimize the chance of falling into error. Now notice how that makes epistemology both a factual thing and a normative thing. So epistemology has normative weight. Now, if you use the term epistemology to apply to the different, I think we should use the term worldviews. Because by using the term epistemology, you are robbing us of the possibility of having some kind of way of contradicting what the other says. And now this is a different other. This is an other with nuclear weapons. It is different from this. We have to have, of course, we have no physical power. We historians or philosophers. But I think there's a kind of rhetorical weight that the term epistemology ought to have. And the weight is that it gives us the set, a name for the set of practices that allow historians to avoid falling too seriously into error and helps them to arrive at some semblance of the truth. Now, that's mainly, that objection, that's not really an objection to anything except the terminology. I think you may have more things to say, however, about empathy. Okay, good. It was a very interesting presentation. It truly.
I propose to take 2 more questions and then the speakers can answer. So first we have Carol. Having a question? I'm afraid you will have to go to the microphone.
So it's not so much a question as an objection to what Alan has said. I think we have a strong enough tradition of situated epistemologies not to have an objection. Because you can have that perspective as included in epistemology, and that's all I wanted to say. I would not retract what you said.
Okay, then Yes, Zoltan?
Yeah, it's me. Okay. Well, thank you. I have a question to everybody. I'm all three of the presenters. I find it very interesting that we had two presentations which which started by pointing out how certain notions have been criticized for decades, and yet they stay with us. I mean, first progress, then the Enlightenment. And then we also had Taynna's presentation, which is sort of a challenge to this kind of knowledge, or the kind of knowledge which is based on those values that Tyson's and Joao's presentations were about. And then I was wondering that, what happens if indigenous knowledges are demanded in a line which challenge a certain hegemony of knowledge. So I was wondering that all three of you, knowing that there were so many challenges before, and then knowing that nevertheless, these notions stay with us and these forms of knowledge also stay with us. So what can we reasonably expect from an exchange, or for at least, putting into conversation these knowledge formations? And just let me, just a brief story. In 2019, I believe, we were with Berber, we were in Shenzhen, and then we've been on the underground, and then we wanted to have a coffee. It's very difficult to get a coffee in China, but we wanted to have a coffee, and then we just noticed that, okay, 3 lines of the underground come together, so let's go up there and get a coffee. And then we go up, and we thought that this must be, a center, because 3 lines come together. We go up, there's nothing. They were just building the whole district, which will be there at some point, but the 3 underground lines already come together there. And then, we were also started to think about that, okay, this is a kind of, over-modernizing the modernizers, blah, 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 and stuff like that. So yes, these are pretty much present. And at the same time, there are these constant challenges. So what exactly is a reasonable expectation towards, that which is challenged, and also that which is challenging knowledges?
Do you want
Alright.
me to have a
You
go?
can go first.
I suppose, that progress has been criticised for so long, and the engram we showed yesterday was great, and I'm going to have to talk to you about getting that off you somehow. But I suppose when you're dealing with a concept such as progress, and that's why I quoted Olaf Scholz at the start, because here is a social democrat who's come into power in Germany, who's talking about leading a progress coalition, and really exploiting that political appeal of the concept of progress. Even if in popular culture or in certain scholarly circles, the concept such as progress is criticized, I do think it is the work of the history of ideas and of historical theory, perhaps as well. Depends how we draw the boundary. We don't need to worry about that. To really clarify concepts. I suppose that's what I see myself as doing. That's certainly what I tried to do with empathy, was to clarify the meaning of concept by going through its history, and applying an analytical approach by combining analysis with diachronicity, I suppose. Now, I certainly, in that last slide, would shudder at the thought if I came across as some sort of advocate of progress. That's certainly not my intention. What I am saying is that for a concept that does have such, it does have so much sway in our language and in the way we think about our purposes of our lives, but also politically, and I think politically especially, that we do need to deal with such a concept. And we can't just say, progress, that's what naive 18th and 19th centuries believed in. But that's the fall prey to the logic of progress, that we're so advanced in our learning that we couldn't possibly believe what they believed 100, 200 years ago. That is exactly fallen prey to this idea that we're more elevated, more advanced by virtue of our situation later in time. I think that's dangerous. So I do want to work with the term, and the way I do that is to break it down into its constituent parts and to put the most emphasis indeed on relative progress, because I think that's the aspect that really illuminates the way in which progress is employed in popular discourse for the most part. Absolute progress. I mean, when you pick up a book on the history of the idea of progress, the idea of progress in 18th century Britain, the idea of progress in antiquity, they're dealing with absolute progress there. Yeah, and that's fine. Go ahead and criticize that, because it's untenable that progress is a natural law and we're just going to sit back and let everything get better. You know, this sort of bourgeois ideology that many voluntarist Marxists and a range of others have been critical of. But this idea that we have to actively create the future that we desire is there in the language of that initial definition of progress. And I don't think it's okay just to brush it aside and try and put it in the rubbish bin. One, because that's impossible. It's part of our language, so we can't, that would be naive to think that we can just throw it in the dustbin. I think it is important to work with the concept and to maybe modify it from the inside. A bit like that, you know, if you want to be in politics, that advice you get, join the party and then change it from the inside. Yeah.
Yeah. Great answer, I think. You want to
this is precisely what I'm trying to do with empathy. I'm trying to discuss empathy also as epistemology, but also as ontology and ethical political concept. So what I'm trying to do is to criticize. I was trying to do it first. I was criticizing the concept of empathy in a common sense, as this idea of putting oneself in the other's shoes. And then I realized that the concept, even though in this common sense, it has some potential to create something from them, something that maybe is not in the traditional of the concept of empathy, or maybe it is, but not actually put like this. I understand that empathy is a way of understanding, but it's not just understanding. Empathy maybe push the limits of understanding to engage with others, respond to others, to relate in a broad sense. So what can be reasonable expectation of this exchange? It's a very hard question. Yeah, I understand that maybe empathy is not the right concept, for example. Maybe it's not. But I think and I feel that empathy can be a concept if we acknowledge the limitations of this concept in the way which it was conceptualized and used by many traditions, and try to reconceptualize or to redefine empathy for contemporary purposes. So I understand that is a changing concept. We don't actually, I'm not actually saying that empathy is what I'm saying now, but I think that empathy can also be what I'm trying to defend here. So, yeah.
Okay. I also have a question on this, but Lars as well.
There was also the third speaker.
I think João has to answer.
Eva was first? Okay, then...
I think João has to answer Zoltan's question.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Zoltan, for this challenging question. Well, what can we expect from the conversation between these different forms of knowledge? I don't think I have a very good answer for that, but perhaps a very short one. A more interesting conversation, at least. That is what I would expect from the encounter between these different forms of knowledge. But I think that the current conversation about enlightenment has become very poor in the last few years and been polarized between those for and against it. And what I've been trying to do is to try to think of another way of conceptualizing enlightenment that escapes this dichotomy, this alternative of being for and against it, and try to recover some of its plurality and polyphony, and recover some of its former ability, capacity to interrogate the present and to be of use again. That's what I would answer.
Did that answer your question, Zoltan?
Oh yeah, I mean, there are no good answers to this question. I was just really curious.
Yeah. How is everything over there?
Hard one.
Then I think Eva, and then Lisa, and then Lars in the room.
Hello, everybody. I really regret that I can't be with you, and I can't even show myself on camera. I am in the middle of Silicon Valley when internet is very weak. Believe me, it's a kind of paradox. I have a question to João. I was waiting for your presentation and also having this opportunity to ask a similar question to Alan. I would like to ask if you see any potential in the discussion about post-secularism to your research. And I'm asking that because Alan probably is one of the very rare theorists of history who is trying to refer to discussion on post-secularism in historical theory. So correct me if I am wrong, but I think you even didn't mention post-secularism, right? So my question would be why you do not feel that this discussion has a potential in the field of theory of history, or maybe you can have some other explanations. And I have also a question to Tyson, if I may. I wonder if you feel that the conceptualization of the idea of progress that has been done in the field of theory of history somehow might help in a current discussion about the relationship between progress and the growth. So, for example, the problem of the question if we might have progress without growth, right? So it's a very relevant discussion in the contemporary ecological crisis and climate change and so on.
Okay, thanks. I propose to indeed take the questions. Apparently Lars was first, so.
We have a very fascinating situation here in the room because Tyson and Taynna are sitting just opposite each other. Tyson has written a wonderful book on empathy. Taynna is just making something out of it and trying to change it and rethink it. Now on the other side, Taynna has presented us indigenous voices which question our understanding of the world in general, of history and of empathy and other kind of practices of making sense of the world. And I wonder, Tyson, how you react on this impulse by her, because you had a sentence in your presentation which I'm really thinking about very much since then. You said we should actively create the future we collectively desire. Alan probably would ask, who is that we? But you know how? I mean, who is that we? Who creates this we? And where are our norms to say, okay, this is a proper desire which we could contribute to a we which is big enough, which doesn't harm any others. I mean, my father, no, not my father, but this generation, they loved great cars, you know, they didn't ask me and they didn't ask my children if this is good desire to have. I mean, maybe we should work on the problem that we always follow our, if there is something like this, desires, which always means violating the desires of maybe future generations. So the very basic question is, what do you mean by we collectively desire, and this having as a motor for the search and the work for progress?
I suppose that's a shorthand way of an appeal to basic participative democratic principles, basically, and an appeal to not become passive, but to reaffirm the connections between historical and political consciousness, and for history to remain, wouldn't say maybe politically engaged is too strong, but that at least with the idea of progress, it raises that question of the way in which we conceive of the future, and really see ourselves as occupying the present, that in which we have various avenues of possibility and of action. In fact, I just published something on the Anthropocene in Rethinking History on this last year, in which I critique the temporality of the Anthropocene in terms reminiscent of sort of classical critiques of determinism, where I talk about the necessity in history, as I value it as a Vickian, as being something that contains an open future. So I suppose that's my shorthand way of saying all that. But I know the collective we is always problematic. It's a lazy way of saying that we should continue to see our future as open, and that when we sit around like this, we have the opportunity, however we form ourselves politically, to deliberate on the best courses of action, and to not fall prey to any kind of temporality of determinism. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
I agree with most everything that you said, but I just don't think that the we is the problem.
Yeah.
Because we don't need to avoid the we, but we have to situate what is the we you're talking about.
Sure. Yeah. And I suppose a lot of the time in my writing, the we is we who are reading this book as well. There's also that literary advice. Yes. But should I
Lisa.
take? Well, I had a question there as well about degrowth.
You already had one? Oh, yeah, yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Maybe you could first just reply to the questions and then go to Lisa's, because there's still some questions coming up. Yeah.
So that was the one about progress and degrowth that I got from you. Yeah, that's fantastic, and I'm excited to announce that is in the book, or the element, I think I have to call it. I do end that very last section with a very brief discussion of degrowth, because that section is called Anti-Progress, and it is dealing with these present-day movements to décroissance, the degrowth movement, to downscale. And again, it fits nicely the title and the sort of setup that I've chosen, questions of scale, and that attempt to I was going to say wind back there, but I don't know if that's really how I want to put it. It's not an attempt, I don't think, to wind back degrowth, but it's an attempt to move away from the ideology of growth. And I do spend quite a lot of time in the 1960s and 1970s, and the rise of GDP and GNP as measurements of growth and thereby progress, in the sense that measurement of economic growth has a futurity in the sense that it sets benchmarks for future effort. So, I mean, I have heard before, I was like, you're not talking about progress anymore, you're talking about growth, but you said you were talking about progress. Yes, growth, but I would say growth is subsumed under a larger concept of progress, because growth still is future orientated in what it orients, it wants us to achieve, working from the present into the future.
Thanks. Yes, Lisa.
Thank you so much. My is much more maybe a commentary, and I really, really appreciate the talk by João, because I think exactly this question about Enlightenment and the interpretation of the 18th century is the moment where philosophers and historians come to conflict. And I think it's, with you, it's absolutely important to understand how we ideologized Enlightenment, which became the idéologie d'État actually in France. And I came to the same conclusion as you had in 10 years of studying of 18th and 17th century. And I think, and because I read at the very beginning the philosophers as philosopher, and then I reread the authors of the 18th and 17th century as historians. And I developed a sort of empathy for the religious people and for the religious orders, and really a sort of sense of injustice towards philosophers who hid and occulted actually the idea, the very roots of criticism and of the idea of problematize the critique of authorities, which is a long tradition in the religious world from the 16th century onwards. And it's interesting to me to reflect about empathy. And as historians, I discover an empathy for the past and for the sort of ideological injustice I feel today, actually. So it's maybe Western, non-Western, is the dichotomy we think about a lot, but my suggestion would be to use history to develop empathy against our own ideologies and yes, and our abuse of history, actually. So I really appreciate your paper.
Thank you, Lisa.
Would you like to reply immediately? You can.
I'm sorry, it's confusing. What did you say, Eline?
You can respond if you want. You can reply.
Sorry, it's the sound is fuzzy.
There you go. I could also briefly respond to Eva's question about secularism and post-secularism.
Yeah, let's maybe respond by you, then your question, and then yeah, because there's so much to say about this.
Yeah, briefly respond. Why I haven't really dealt much with secularism or post-secularism. I did publish an article, I think, it was in History and Theory, I think, back around 2013, engaging with Dominic Le Capra. And Eva, the reason I haven't gotten back to that is because people didn't ask me to write on it, because they asked me to write on other things, teaching issues. But you're absolutely right. Secularization and the counters in post-secularization are deeply connected, of course, in interesting ways with notions of progress, and they're also deeply connected with the Enlightenment. And I've tended to avoid even using the Enlightenment, except in quotation marks, recently. But yes, I think post-secularism could perhaps connect with the affective dimension in the human universe. It's a kind of recasting. I take it as a kind of recasting of religion, but I cannot speak as an expert on that subject because I haven't done enough research on it. So, and it's nice seeing you, Eva.
Okay, question by Valderas and then reply from the speakers.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tyson, Taynna, and João, for your very thought-provoking presentations. I will have one question for Tyson. Of course, our research interests have very much to do with. So yeah, I actually have a lot of things to point out, but of course we can always talk about later. I will just make two observations. First, I completely agree with you when you claim that we should not just get rid of the idea of progress, considering on the, for example, the political appeal of the concept of progress. And not only in the center or the left wing or even the right wing, they still try to appeal to this idea of progress, right? If you think about, for example, how some or many of left-wing groups, at least in Brazil, I think in the US is the same, they entitle themselves as progressists, right? So it would be naive, as you said, to just ignore the centrality of the concept nowadays. On the other hand, the concept of progress is still also, let's say, employed by, let's say, conservative ideologues as well. I come from a country that has order and progress in its very flag. And recently, we in Brazil, we witnessed the coup d'etat against Dilma Rousseff. And this very idea of order and progress was reclaimed by those who made the coup d'etat in 2016. And I was searching for, because it was very famous in Brazil on that time. So Michel Temer, who was the former president of Brazil, he was the vice president of Dilma Rousseff, and then he became the president after the coup d'etat. He was one of the main actors of that political coup d'etat. And then in one of his discourses, his statements, he said something like, I will try to translate it very quickly, because it also points to the distinction between the short-termism of progress, as I said, and I would say maybe this absolute progress that you rightly point out, that there is no a single progress, but very, let's say, layers of progress, right? So if I may just, oh my God, this disappear, but I have another one. Yes, I'm here. So he said, we can't speak of crisis no more. Let's just work. By the way, a few days ago, I passed by a gas station, and I saw a guy with a sign that reads, "Don't speak about crisis. Let's work." And then he says, I want to see if I can spread out 10 or 20 million billboards throughout Brazil, because this creates a climate of harmony, of optimism, isn't it? So let's not talk about crisis. Let's just work. Our motto is order and progress. So it's interesting to see, because in the scholarly field, in the academia, we see that we are very used to read people like, okay, the idea of progress is in crisis, nobody believes in a progressive view of history anymore, but when you see in the political or social discourse, this concept is very much present. So we shouldn't, get rid of it. And the other thing that I think that I completely agree with you, as I think I just said it, you don't have only one progress. You have, at least, as you point out, 5 different layers of the concept. I was thinking about Walter Benjamin when you Walter Benjamin, the very famous thesis on the concept of history. The main enemy of Benjamin in his last text is the ideology of progress. And he's trying, let's say, to reform or to reconceptualize a new concept of history that can go against the idea of progress. And maybe that's why he insists on the idea of the Jetztzeit, the now time, and so on. I don't want to go much into it, but because I just pointed to Walter Benjamin here, because you said in the end of your presentation that we should be skeptical about this absolute progress, right? Mm. Although we should also, let's claim an actively concept of progress, because it leads us to try to, create common futures, so to say. Although Walter Benjamin may respond like progress leads us more to conformism. passivity. Yes, but because you have differentiated 5 layers of progress, maybe Walter Benjamin was referring to the absolute progress, whereas you are much more defending, right, this relative progress, maybe in the sense of Thomas Kuhn, I don't know. So yeah, I have some, as you see, some loose thoughts here, because it was very thought-provoking. I was just, yeah, so if you can elaborate a little bit on these observations, and then we can talk more later.
Sure.
And for Taynna, I would just also ask very briefly. I know I'm taking too much time here. To elaborate a little bit more on the relation between paying attention and empathy. You said that this notion of paying attention will be important to reconceptualize the idea of empathy. So in what sense do you think about this? Thank you very much.
Maybe first, let's João react to the comments by Lisa if he wants to, and then we can go back to the speakers here in Puebla. If you want to react, of course.
Sure. First, I would like to say something about Eva Dabanska's question about post-secularism. In fact, I didn't mention post-secularism in my talk. I think Alan perhaps is more well equipped to answer your question. I'm not sure what. It's a very controversial concept, such as secularism also is. But perhaps I could say very briefly that I'm not sure we have past secularism, and I like Charles Taylor's notion of secularity when he defines it as a condition in which belief in God has become one option among others. And he adds, frequently not the easiest one to embrace. So perhaps this is what I could say about post-secularism. I'm not sure if I think we have entered a post-secularist age. Lisa, I completely agree with you. I think history is a very important to empathize with people different from ourselves, and I think I subscribe to your views about its effect. That's it. Thank you, Eline.
Okay, thanks. Then I guess Tyson to build
Just
in.
to respond to that, yeah, sure. You know what, I'd really like to take an inventory of, because I was having this discussion just last night, I kind of take it for granted, I suppose, that progressives are on the left, because where I come from in the United States, to be a progressive is to be a liberal, yeah? But I am increasingly aware that there are some other national traditions that to be progressive could also be on the other side of politics. Now, what's interesting though is that progressives tend to be on the left, yeah, and then, as I said in my talk, tend to scoff at the idea of progress. Yes. I don't believe in that. That's some positivistic stuff from the 18th and 19th century. So that's a bit of an irony for me that kind of makes me want to sort of say, well, no, actually, let's think carefully about what progress is and the different layers. I like it that you put it that way, the different layers of that concept. But I actually live in what's referred to as the Bible Belt of Norway, and it's a tiny little part of the southern part of the Scandinavian peninsula that is highly Protestant, highly Lutheran, and it's actually the stronghold of the Progress Party. It does terribly in national elections, but it does very well in the Bible Belt, where I live, unfortunately. Break that down. Yeah, so of course, progress to the Progress Party is not what Olaf Schulz is talking about. It's a libertarian party. It's anti-immigration. And if they were to hold up their philosophical prophet, it would be Hayek. And it'd be Hayek where he says, planned progress is not progress at all. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a nice quote from Hayek, yeah? And this is part of my chapter, Everybody's Progress, is that idea that if you plan what you want to occur in the future, well, that's not actually progress, because that's picking winners, which of course for a hardcore neoliberal is just out of the question, yeah? Progress has to be a consequence of the spontaneous operation of the market. Yeah, let's not go into Adam Smith, but you get where I'm going with that.
Yes.
Now, in German and also the Scandinavian languages, progress literally translates as step forward. Yeah, and I like to point that out. I like to point that out as well to people who rankle at the alleged teleology of talking about progress as something that's future orientated. I don't think it's teleological merely to say that human beings have desires and goals and they work towards them. Yes. It's very different to saying there's an end of history that we should all work towards. Berry wasn't saying that. No one's really said that. So the charge of teleology to me is a little lazy. It's having goals, it's having desires, and it's working towards them. And I see that as fundamentally part of the semantic meaning of progress, especially in German, especially in the Scandinavian languages, but more widely as well. And that's why I think it's a concept to be taken seriously, to be skeptical of, to be wary of, but to appreciate its different layers and to, well, at least my work as a scholar is to engage in conceptual clarification, having an argument, but first and foremost, just trying to come to some sort of better understanding of the complexity of a composite concept like this. Like empathy is a highly composite concept to bring it apart and try and understand its constituent parts.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Valdir, for your question. This idea of attentiveness. This idea of being attentive, I brought from the authors Tom van Doren, Ihan Kipsey, and Ursula Minster. I don't know if I pronounced the names correctly, but they have this article entitled Multispecies Studies, Cultivating Arts of Attentiveness, published in Environmental Humanities Journal. So they basically define arts of attentiveness as a kind of cultivation of skills for both paying attention to others and meaningfully responding. So what I understand as empathy is related to this idea of perceiving the other as a kind of sense, and the same way the idea that we can respond to these needs, emotions, and experiences of the others.
Thank you very much. I just have one question. Just about the empathy one, if is it okay to ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I haven't wanted to ask a question because I'm part of the panel, but I just wondered, really great. Just one thing to think about maybe, and that is the critics of empathy. So there are some really good philosophers. Jesse Prinz, I think, I would recommend the most, who kind of try to demonstrate that empathy might not be this sugar-coated silver bullet to all our problems. And one of the things they point out is that empathy tends to only work in contexts of proximity and immediacy. For instance, studies that one of the classic studies they show is that if there's a homeless person who's really suffering on the street, people who basically have to walk over them to get on with their day are quite likely to give assistance. But put that same person on the other side of the street, the exact same person suffering, and virtually no one crosses the street to help them out. So the argument that these critics of empathy make, based on experiments like this, is to say that yes, empathy works well in contexts of immediacy, and of proximity, but maybe you need something a little tougher, a little stronger than empathy for when there's distance involved. And it seems to me that transcultural difference could be an example of that, perhaps where something like rational compassion might be more of a motivating force for understanding the other than empathy. But that's just something that I think it's important also to bring in the criticisms of empathy as well. But what is your thoughts on that in terms of empathy, proximity, and distance?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I have been talking a lot about it with my supervisor, Eva Domeska, this idea that you're telling about this kind of personal distress, because it's the name that I know from this biography on psychology, because they are discussing how empathy has like different kinds of emotion reactions. So empathy can be a kind of sympathy or compassion towards the other, but empathy also can be personal distress. Empathy can be a kind of I don't remember all the names now of these four reactions: sympathy, personal stress. There's other kinds of different reactions, but I understand that empathy, of course, is not a silver bullet. I don't think that empathy is what I'm trying to do in my presentation is to acknowledge the limits in the problems, the periods of empathy. So I'm aware of this kind of problems related to the distance and the proximity to the other, and that sometimes it cannot be actually clear if we are getting to know the other, or we are just projecting ourselves on the other. And this kind of distance, I understand that distance is very important. For the concept that I'm trying to develop, distance is very important, more than identification. But I don't know if the concept of compassion is more appropriate than empathy to discuss it, because of course, compassion is part of the definition of empathy, because it's one of these rules in religious texts and so on. But I understand that compassion and sympathy, they bring an idea of feeling for the others, not feeling in or feeling with the others. So I think that compassion has sort of patronized an idea of the other. So that's why I prefer to use empathy.
Great. I suppose just a quick rejoin is that in that example of walking down the street and helping out someone who's on your side and not helping out the person who's on the other side, sort of the argument for rational compassion is that you would be motivated to cross the street to help out that person if you ethically were committed to the idea that homelessness is terrible and that I should help out people in need, and that would actually be a better moral motivator to go help them than just relying on empathy. And I just think that's an argument that's always worthwhile considering in this sort of context.
Yeah, there's another question by Alison Landsberg. I only noticed it now.
I know that we're completely out of time, but since we've all written on empathy, I will just add my 2 cents, and I've very much enjoyed this discussion. For me, one of the things that I tried to emphasize in talking about empathy is that I understand, whereas sympathy begins with a presumption of sameness between the sympathizer and the person being or object being sympathized with, empathy linguistically starts from a position of difference, right? And so there's a presumed difference between the person who is going to be making the connection and the other, right? So that there is always in empathy the work of crossing a bridge, right? that you are moving from where you are to where someone else is. Now, so I personally think of sympathy as being kind of colonizing emotionally, over-identifying emotionally, where at least empathy presumes a kind of cognitive work to understand where the other is. And so to me, that's been the difference. I mean, I have sort of stepped away from empathy in my own thinking for a lot of the reasons that other people have as well, but it did seem to me that distinction does remain. I think empathy presumes at its core a fundamental difference and distance between, the empathizer and the other, basically.
I'm not sure if, yeah, of course, the idea of sympathy begins with this idea of sameness, of a kind of shared humanity that we are part of. But in the same way, I think that idea of sympathy today is more the opposite, because sympathy is more like an over differentiation of the other. So we can take care of the other because we see this differentiation. We feel for the other because we are not in the situation of the other. We're not in the other's place. So I understand that empathy, this role of difference in empathy is different because I'm not talking only about difference, but also identification. So empathy has these two sides. I don't know how to call it, but empathy has identification, but also differentiation, or maybe what Karen Barrett called differentiation entangling. So it's a kind of entanglement, but also differentiating in the same time. So I understand that more than identifying empathy as a kind of difference, I prefer to use empathy as a kind of distance, because distance apply both identity and differentiation. I think distance it is what we need to understand the other in the same way, understand our own position related to the other, and how by understanding, engaging, and responding to the other, we can change at the same time ourselves. So I think it's a multiple directional relation. It's not just understanding the other, but understanding ourselves at the same time.
Yes. You want to quickly respond to that, Alison? Or is your hand still up from your question before? Okay, then maybe Kalle. I would encourage you also to keep it brief, because indeed we're running a bit out of time, but at the same time it's a very intriguing discussion.
I just wanted to weigh in on these discussions about empathy again, because there's, as Tyson said, there's lots of criticisms, and one important one is by Taynna Mendonça, I think, where she just notes that empathy can also disempower us, because it's this identification. I think I personally find Mendonça most convincing on how empathy functions, so I just wanted to mention that, because it's basically in terms of distance and proximity, it's the opposite argument to what you were mentioning. So.
So if I understand empathy as a kind of disempowerment,
You identify too much,
okay.
and then it removes your agency.
Yeah, that's sort of the early phenomenological critique of empathy as well. Edmund Husserl in the 1910s was talking about the problem of empathy. It's a kind of empty form of knowledge, because you might have that proximity, you might have that fusion with the subject, but what do you do with that? Yeah, so it actually removes you from your own position in a sense.
I see that this idea of identifying so much, and I think is a little bit more complicated, because I understand that when we are empathizing with the other that is not in our situation, doesn't have the same experience that we have, we are not talking about really about the identification, talking about differentiation. But when we are talking about a kind of empathy related to people who I see or I perceive as a sort of part of the same group that I belong, so I think in this moment empathy is more like an identification. Yeah. So I understand that it can be disempowerment, but I don't think it really is disempowerment. How can I say this? Disempowerment is right. But I don't really see every relation of empathy as a disempowerment. All right, thank you. There's yet another question, but unless if you can keep it brief, we can give you the floor. Otherwise, I propose to discuss some other time.
Maybe I'll just add very quickly. So I have been thinking exactly about this point of different relational perspectives towards the other, and I'm working on virtual reality and how it actually trains users or the audience to take different perspectives towards the mediated lived experiences of past individuals. And I just wanted to, listening to all this long discussion, which was very interesting, just to say that I think it is helpful to think about it in terms of talking maybe not about empathy, because it's such a loaded term, but talking about relational perspectives towards the other that contain projection, that contain dialogical attention, that contain identification. And they serve a very different function. And it was curious to hear these mentions of Alexander Dugin by Alan McGill, and this kind of relativist stance that, you know, we have our truth and you have yours. And at the same time, even as I recognize and understand the importance of that distance, of preserving the distance, I want to actually point out, I think that how important it is to prevent certain kind of conflicts, that proximity is crucial. And just since you brought up Russia and you brought up Dugin, what we see very well right now is that to understand Russia's aggression in Ukraine and to hear Ukrainian voices, we can see that there is a lack of effective proximity. The lack of effective proximity to understand what's happening in Ukraine by Western commentators. And that is, I mean, it's a staggering problem that I, as a person coming from Central and Eastern Europe, see. So I think in these discussions, we have to not to lose this point that we need both critical distance and effective proximity, and maybe not get lost in discussions, what is empathy? But I think we should be aware of how we need to combine these two. So thanks. I'm sorry for my long comment.
No, thank you. It was a very good remark, I think. Unless you want to add something, I think we should conclude because we run out of time. But thanks for the three speakers for